Hi people, it's Archivist here, coming at you with a review for South Park: The Fractured But Whole. And that really is a fantastic title because it tells you that even without playing the game, if you find that crude and off-putting, you really won't like the game, because this is very much representative of what's to come throughout the entire experience in South Park the game. So there's a lot of crude humour, as is synonymous with South Park, but perhaps even more so than you might find in a typical episode. But it doesn't just rely on this, it is something that uses intelligent humour here and there, and also has a good game underneath, which is of course paramount when you're creating a video game adaptation of anything. You have to make sure you get the game right and don't just rely on the source material, which this game doesn't, but it embraces it at the same time, which is quite rare really. You've got a case of the source material being authentically represented, and there's no doubt about that, but also some really solid RPG mechanics to throw into the mix. So throughout this review I won't be shying away from spoilers whatsoever. I'd like to talk about it in its entirety, and we will begin with the story. And it begins with you right off the end of the Stick of Truth, which was the last South Park game, where you're the king now and you're fighting the other kids in the medieval version of their playing around, but then it very quickly shifts to superhero when Cartman turns up and he tells everyone we're doing superheroes now, and then without any real dispute everyone's playing superheroes instead, and that's why you start playing superhero, and you're back to being the guy at the very bottom and you have to work your way back up. And in South Park style there's a lot of crude twists and turns, but also some really fun little parodies and satire. For me, I really enjoy South Park, I'm a big fan of it, but I also am a little conflicted on some of its humour. So I think South Park is in fact unparalleled in how it will satirise absolutely anything and do it to the utter extreme. It is not afraid to satirise anything at all, even in some cases in the past, at the risk of the lives of the creator. But on the other hand, there's the crude toilet humour side of South Park, which I don't really like, and you really can't get away from the fact that this game does heavily focus on the toilet humour side of things, because your character's main standout point is the fact that he has fart powers and he can turn back time or warp time and just disrupt people with it, and that's something that I just don't inherently enjoy. I more had to just kind of get used to and accept. I never thought, you know what, this is really clever, really funny humour. I can't say I ever laughed at a single fart related joke in this, even when it starts to get really extreme. But there are some really clever little parodies they have. One that's quite early on is where you walk into your room, you turn on your Game Sphere, which is like your next gen console, but your current gen console parody, and it's stuck at 24% loading, and even if you come back like way after the fact, it's still 24% loading, which is quite a nice poke at how we seem to be getting constant updates in our consoles these days. So that's just one little thing. Also lots of references to many South Park episodes. You've got the 6th graders who are constantly harassing you, the Raisins girls, funnily enough. I'm surprised that they were actually an enemy in the game. You've got homeless people, of all things. You've got crab people. You've got ninjas. It's all referencing South Park in nice and interesting ways. But it does get very creative at certain points, particularly towards the end, and this is where spoilers really come in thick and fast. There are some time travel elements that, again, you employ using your farts, and it warps the way that some of the more shocking decisions you have to make in the game are nullified. And well, the thing is, I think time travel is such a tempting thing for storytellers to take advantage of, because it always delivers interesting results, in my opinion. It's just something it's very difficult to go wrong with. But there are some moments in the game that, even for me, were quite shocking, but I don't like to criticise South Park for being shocking, because I think it has to be, otherwise it will lose its identity. So, for example, there's one bit where you go to the church and then the priest tells you to go into the back room to face your fears, and it's basically two Catholic priests trying to rape you and you have to fight them off. That was quite a shocking moment for me. I couldn't believe they did that, and I felt quite uncomfortable throughout the entire fight, to be honest. But it's that kind of uncomfortable that you kind of admire them for going there. And there's some other stuff like the social commentary aspect of that the police seem to only be locking up black people, and then it starts in very much South Park style going really absurd with that notion where it turns out they've been feeding them to this old god. You kind of hope they're not being intentionally racist. You hope it's just absurd social commentary, because Christ, if this is a kind of a direct humour rather than a social commentary humour, they are quite racist. You really hope they're not. The joke, I like to think was the joke anyway, was that there is no logical reason for discrimination in the police force, and therefore this is what we're going to throw in as the explanation, is that the police are sacrificing them to an old god. It's not really laugh out loud funny, it's just something that you kind of look at and think, you know what, that's quite a clever yet absurd backwards Black Mirror on reality, and that's what South Park is as a whole. And maybe that's, in a nutshell, the greatest compliment I can give to Fractured But Whole, is that it's just unadulterated South Park. It does not pull any punches. It's just as offensive as the show. And I mean, I don't want to say it's as funny or not as funny as the show, because I find South Park very hit and miss. I think it's at its best when it has a really focused storyline and it's just parodying something. I've been watching the most recent episodes, and one of them is where they're taking the mick out of Trump, who's constantly sending inflammatory tweets towards North Korea, and then Tweak tries to send them some cupcakes to try and reconcile, and then Trump turns that into oh, he's just screwing with you guys. And then it's like this massive war between Tweak and the North Koreans. It's things like that I think are really funny, because it's taking something in real life that is serious and then making it into something that's totally absurd and funny, and that's what you get with this. I don't ever get the sense that the creators behind South Park have any kind of malice behind their humour. It's all just in the total goal of making you think of how absurd certain things are by making fun of them. I thought of it as there are two ways of considering people who watch South Park. There are people who think Cartman is funny because Cartman is saying what we're all thinking, and then there are people who think Cartman is funny because he is the absolute worst idea of an American. You know, he's the stereotypical racist, offensive, gluttonous guy, and that's where I think it's the better way to view South Park, is to think that a lot of the time its characters are intentionally meant to be disliked. If you're someone who consistently agrees with Cartman, you're probably a bad person. If you're someone who consistently dislikes Cartman for all the awful things he's done, you're a good person, essentially. I think it's fair to say there are certain people in this world that it's just fun to dislike because they have no redeeming qualities, and that's the sort of crux behind Cartman as a character. And that's exactly the same in the Fractured But Whole, where it turns out that not only is he the main leader of one of the main factions, because he's the leader of Coon and Friends, because he is the Coon. What a crazy name that is. I can't believe I'm just used to hearing that name now. But he's also the main villain in Mitch Connor, who's like his weird alter ego, where it's just his hand making gestures to pretend it's a person, and it's just a joke that keeps on going. And I think I remember from the show, I think it started out as his hand was Jennifer Lopez for some reason. I can't remember why, but it was Jennifer Lopez, and it turned out it wasn't. It was some agent called Mitch Connor, and now Mitch Connor's the one who's trying to disrupt the city by putting cat urine into everyone's drugs and alcohol. It's just totally mad. That is, if you just like random mad humour, this will really speak to you, as is the South Park way. But then there's the underlying parody of superheroes and superhero culture and what it's become, because the basis of it at the beginning is that you've got Cartman's franchise, Coon and Friends, versus Timmy's or Mysterion's franchise called Freedom Pals, and they both want to start off their Netflix series and then create a cinematic universe pretty much like Marvel versus DC, although it's never explicitly hinted at which one is which, because you've got Jimmy, who's a parody of the Flash. He's even got the lightning bolts, but Cartman says that he thinks he's Marvel, so it's never made clear which one is meant to be which. And that's, it does cynically show that both of the cinematic universes are created in a way that's purely meant to just get money out of people. I don't think that's a massively brave criticism to make, though, because even Marvel themselves are quite open about the fact that they have created a sprawling cinematic universe with a very business mindset behind it, but people forgive them because, and quite rightly so, because they just make quality movies, right? I don't think Marvel make bad films. I mean, even Iron Man 2, which is regarded as one of the weaker films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is still a good film. So they're taking the mick out of something that is true. They're right to take the mick out of it, but at the same point, it's not something that people are shying away from saying in real life anyway, so it loses its edge in that regard. Also, a nice thing is that all the characters feel very true to their show counterparts, and they're all voiced in the same way, so it's not like there's any substitute here, so it does really feel like you're part of the show. And that's where we can bring the graphics into this as well, because they are pure South Park visuals, right? It's uncompromised. It's actually a very unique situation we find ourselves here in, because South Park visuals are so simple yet charming. They can be perfectly, uncompromisingly represented in video game form. So when you're walking around the town, when you're in the middle of a battle, not so much when you're in the middle of a battle because the grid gives it away, but maybe when you're talking to people, you could take a snapshot of that and it could easily be mistaken for a South Park episode. It is almost novel in and of itself just to be walking around South Park and seeing all these places that you know from the show, and not just seeing them in video game form. These are the locations from South Park, because the graphics are one-to-one representations of what we know and love. So you can just walk throughout the show with total freedom and go into any place you want, and it gives you a lot to explore and also incentives to explore because you unlock items which make you more powerful. And that will bring us on to the gameplay aspect of Fractured But Whole, which is surprisingly strong. Maybe I shouldn't say surprising, because Stick of Truth was also very strong, but if you're someone who just sees this as a licensed-based video game, then you might think it, like I said at the beginning of the review, rests on its laurels of the success of South Park, but no, it does make a good game here. So the leap we have over the original South Park game is that it's not just turn-based, but it's now movement-based. So you have a grid-based system where you can move a limited amount of tiles throughout the battle, and you position yourself and then you attack. So you have to consider where you are on the battlefield, as well as other strategies like the timing. You have to make sure you keep your allies healed up, and you have to consider if you want to do a heavy single target attack or maybe an AoE attack if you're facing lots of enemies. You can even do some debuff attacks like freezing opponents so they miss the next turn. You can confuse them so there's a chance that they might attack their allies by mistake. You can charm them, which pretty much makes them yours. You can gross them out, which means they throw up every turn and take a little bit of damage, or they can bleed, where they just take a little bit of damage. So lots of effects there, but again, when you've got things like gross out, it very much anchors it in the South Park ideology of being extremely gross. So there's that. Also an interesting creative decision they have made, and maybe I'm remembering it wrong, and if I am, I apologise, but I think in the Stick of Truth, most of the animations were based in reality. So if you were doing like a fireball attack, for example, you'd throw a lighter at them, or if you're doing electric attack, you'd get out like a circuit and throw it at them. But in this, all the attacks are as if the kids are actually using superpowers. So if you do a laser blast, they're actually laser blasts. If you're doing a freeze attack, it's actually a freeze attack, right? Bombs are bombs, and all the ultimate attacks look like they would look if you properly had superpowers. At first, I thought this took away from it a bit, because it means it's a slightly less creative look. But on the other end of things, it does limit what you can do if you're only allowing your powers to match things you could do in real life if you were being creative. So it's sacrificing a little bit of creativity in the name of variety, and it's a fair trade-off, and one that I quite liked. I think the animations are pretty interesting in this game. I chose to primarily be an elementalist, although you can truly mix and match your powers. Let's start with that first, in fact. So at the beginning of the game, you're asked to choose your class. I think I began with a blaster, but you can be a speedster, I think, or a tanky character that I forget the name of. But then you keep speaking to Cartman and he'll let you unlock more classes, and it's not like you switch between the classes and all your abilities change. You can swap out whichever abilities you want. So you've got 3 normal attacks and then 1 ultimate attack, and you can just mix and match them all you want. And then by the end of the game, you have access to every single class, I think, or I didn't check, but I think it was either every class or almost all the classes, so you have a lot of abilities. So you can make your character truly tailor-made to whatever you want. And it's quite a good system. I really like the look of the ultimate attacks. I think the Elementalist one again looks fantastic, where you kind of freeze your hand and then rockify, if rockify is a word, rockify one of your hands, and then summon water, and then lightning goes into your eyes, and then there's a massive storm. There's a lot of detail to it, and considering that's not your only ultimate, and that each individual character has an ultimate, they put a lot of effort into it. And again, that's the kind of thing they might not have been able to achieve if they were going for the old DIY attack power stuff. I'm not sure what the official term would be, but we'll go DIY attack power. A little side compliment I want to make for the game is that it can sometimes bring you back to reality. So imagine you're fighting in the middle of a street in a battle. Sometimes a car will come up and everyone says car, and then the battle will stop and they run to the pavement, and then the car goes on by and then it resumes. Although that joke did sort of lose its impact when it happened to me for the 5th time. And another thing is, that's not really as funny when you're fighting ninjas. It's funny when you're fighting against other kids, because it's like kids are fighting in a street and a car's coming past. But when they're ninjas, why would a ninja care if a car's coming up behind them? And that brings me on to something that I just don't quite get about this game, is that do they have superpowers or not? Because they are able to attack other kids, which makes sense, because the kids would all be in on the joke, right? They'd all be fighting each other and pretending they have attack power. And that's what the game suggests at a lot of points, is that they're just making up the rules. But then you fight things like homeless people who are apparently also in on it, because they're also fighting you and abiding by the rules, and they're accepting that they're being frozen or smashed apart, and they end up with blood all over their face at the end. And it didn't really make sense. In fact, it never really makes sense. I don't think it was ever explained if they're actually using superpowers or not. I don't get it. I think it's just South Park style. I think one of the running jokes of South Park is that for no good reason at all, adults will just go in with what the kids do for no real reason. So I think it's that they're pretending and the adults are just in on it as well for whatever reason. I don't quite understand what it is, but hey, it is what it is. Don't take it too seriously. It's South Park. So that's just something that confused me a little bit. That's where the DIY stuff made more sense, because if you're throwing a lighter at someone and pretending you're doing a fireball attack, at least you're still doing a fireball attack. So whatever. We'll try and not let that keep me up at night while I try and wonder if they actually had superpowers or not. Because there are other points where Kenny says to you that only you and he have powers, where he has immortality, which we know from the show, and you have magical time-bending fart powers, or just really strong powers. It's like there's just some really weird moments with that as well. Like I think the fact they made Scott Malkinson Captain Diabetes, that did make me laugh a little bit, to be fair. So if he ever wants to use super strength, what he does is he overdoses on like sugar, and then he injects himself with some insulin afterwards. It's just so crazy and weird. And if you want him to pull up like an obstacle, you have to fart in his face to piss him off, and then he'll get so angry that he'll be able to do it. You won't see this anywhere else. Only South Park would be this outlandish so as to do it. And maybe that's it, ultimately. Some of these jokes are so strange and so weird and so bizarre that you just know they won't be copied because they're just so unique to South Park's sensibilities. I think Rick and Morty maybe comes close to some of this stuff, but yeah, South Park I think is still the king of gross out humour. I mean, one of the very first things you do in this game is take a shit, right? That's one of the first things you do in this game. And that's something that I immediately thought, okay, is this going to be the whole game? But then there were some other things that, again, brought it back to being kind of funny satire that I really appreciated. I liked the base idea of the Coon and Friends versus Freedom Pals, and the weird conundrum aspect of, is Cartman pretending to have Mitch Connor as his hand, or is he just mentally ill? I was genuinely doubting that for a very long time until it becomes obvious which one it is. In terms of lasting appeal, I don't think I'll be playing this game for a super long time. There are a few collectathon stuff where characters will tell you to go and collect 10 of these or 10 of that. But once you've done the storyline, which I think is the strongest aspect of the game, I just don't see myself playing this much more. In fact, having finished the game as of this review, I can't see myself spending many more hours on it. I think I've explored a lot of the game. I've seen all the most interesting story aspects. I'm going to go on a final hunt, see if there's anything I haven't seen yet. You know, there are a few areas I never got to during the story that I found now. But that's maybe a weakness of this game. I know for Stick of Truth, I never really got into the meta game if there was one. I went through the story, massively enjoyed it, and then never played it again. And that's something that might be this game's greatest problem, is that the Stick of Truth existed before this. When the Stick of Truth came out, this whole idea of playing in what is a perfect recreation of the South Park world was new and novel, and that's something that you could say was a massive bonus for the game. That's something you simply can't say now because it's been done before, and it was done many years before. But that's another thing, right? This game has come out many years after the Stick of Truth, and so it's not a case of you're revisiting the same town and it seems too familiar. It was a while ago, especially if you bought it when it first came out, and they've changed enough about it that maybe I shouldn't really say that, because it's not like the layout of the town has changed, and there's not like any massive design changes. There are a few new alterations where the main storylines of South Park have come up, but it is the same structure because how could they get around that? It's about South Park. But again, there's been so much time between this and the Stick of Truth that I'm more than happy to revisit it. I really do like this kind of games. I was a big fan of the Simpsons games when I was younger. I really liked Simpsons Hit and Run. I really liked the Simpsons game, simply titled that, in 2007, because something that you watch quite a lot and find very funny is something that you can properly interact with, and that's something that these two South Park games have done like no other cartoon game spin-off, because it's just such a perfect recreation of it. It's something that I think would be so perfect for the Switch because, of course, it's not demanding at all. It's just 2D visuals. So it would be nice if it came to that, because then you'd have the benefit of handheld. And that's something that I find myself thinking for any simplistic game that I play on my PlayStation or on my PC. It'd be nice to see it on the Switch, but I appreciate we can't have that for everything. And maybe South Park's humour isn't really Nintendo's, Nintendo's area. It is something that's very crude, right? When I explain South Park to people, when I try to get them into it, I can have a very hard time, and sometimes it depends on the episode that you first see. For me, the first episode of South Park I saw was the Warcraft, Make Love Not Warcraft episode, and I really liked it because they were parodying World of Warcraft, which I was playing at the time, and that got me into it initially. There's some ones that I just remember as absolute classics. There's the one where Cartman's taking the mick out of Wendy for trying to create awareness for breast cancer, and then for once he gets his comeuppance where he gets beaten up by Wendy, and I quite like that one because it's just showing you that there's actually a few things in the episode I liked. Number one, that Cartman actually gets his repercussion in the end, and secondly, that it shows that because of Cartman's behaviour, that people can be very prideful in public, but then utterly pathetic in private to try and make themselves look better in public, which I think is a very true thing. And that's what South Park is in a nutshell, really. It's a case of a very crude exterior, sometimes masking a very nuanced interior. And not everyone sees South Park as that. Some people do just see it as something that's got some very amusing and unique toilet humour, but then there are a lot of other people who really enjoy the satire behind it, and that's something that I really like. And again, it's something that this game does pretty well. And I do think that the combat in the game feels pretty unique. The grid-based system that I mentioned earlier, I have not in fact played a game that uses a system like this. I've been told that games like Fire Emblem, I think it is, use something like this where it's a grid-based, turn-based game. But for me, I don't usually play anything that's turn-based and then uses this movement system as well. And as someone who plays a fair number of games, I don't think it's an outlandish thing to say that a lot of people will not have experienced a system like this, which will make it feel very unique and very fresh. And it's a combat system that I really enjoy. I think it's quite satisfying. It's got strategy to it. You can put the difficulty up at will, which is a nice thing, because you, at times with this sort of game, you just want to see the next bit in the story, and at other times you want to have to really test your ability to consider your attacks. Also, we'll just mention a few other things I might have forgotten. There's the basic leveling up that you'd get in any RPG. You get more powerful, and this is complemented by the fact that you will over time collect relics, and relics are absolutely any old junk that are assigned some random value of power. So it could just be a piece of paper that is level 20. There could be the Necronomicon and it's level 100. You can also use DNA strands to modify what you're best at. For me, it was enhancing my Elementalist ability, so I always kept that as high as I could. So you've got your standard RPG stuff. Also, the character customization, God, I haven't even touched on that yet, is very good. You build up some of your attributes via the character sheet over time. You decide your gender, your sexual orientation, your religion in very South Park style. At the very beginning of the game, you're given lots of options for your character, and of course it's South Park, so you have to create it in that style, but I found myself quite easily able to make a version of myself in South Park that I feel like I would look like if I was created in the South Park style. And then on top of that, you can give yourself costumes, because of course it's a superhero game, what would it be without costumes? And you collect these over time, and by the end of it you'll find yourself with a lot. And something that I did really like is that the costumes have no bearing on your power level. There's no statistic bound to them, because that's of course bound with the relics. So you're just choosing a look that you think suits you, which is nice and refreshing. Something that I feel can get lost in a lot of these games where gear determines your power level is that you never choose the gear based on how it looks. You're too focused on how strong you are. That's why I think transmog systems like in World of Warcraft are very good. So the fact that you can make yourself look exactly how you want to look in this game is very nice. You play a silent protagonist, by the way, so it's the kind of character that has very much been created to be a version of you transplanted into the world of South Park. And as you might imagine, they constantly take the mick out of the fact that you don't speak. But that's not an original thing. I've known games with silent protagonists to be like that for a long time. So, closing thoughts. As much praise as I've given to the game, there is a very fine line between the people who will and won't like this. In fact, just to be safe, I'd say this. If you're a fan of South Park and you really like it and you really enjoy the humour, I think you'll really like this. If you don't like South Park or you've never watched South Park, I would be very cautious in giving you a recommendation. I would strongly encourage you watch at least one episode of the show to get an idea for what the humour is like and the fact it's not afraid to be too crude. And then if that's something that you like, you really enjoy, or just find acceptable, you're quickly acclimatized to the humour that's in this game. And that is my way of telling you if you should get this game or not. It's certainly a quality experience, but it won't be for everyone, that's for sure. But it was for me. I really enjoyed it, and I absolutely recommend getting South Park, The Fractured But Whole, if you're a fan of South Park. So, as always people, thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.